And thank you for joining us this morning. Excuse me. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. Just a few words about Orthogonal. We help improve patient outcomes faster by accelerating the development of software as a medical device, connected device systems, and digital therapeutics for companies building regulated device software. And the way we do that is by taking the best of modern product management and software engineering tools and techniques and fusing them with the safety and effectiveness sort of as actuated in our industry by compliance, quality, and regulatory. Great session today. We're pretty excited. We've had a lot of fun preparing it. Predetermined change control plans, accelerating post-market updates to AI algorithms and device software. So PCCP is the hottest new kid on the block right now, or one of them. And I think for unlike a lot of things in hype, I think for some really good reason. There's some challenges here, but there's a lot of potential for PCCP to really be an accelerant on things happening with AI, ML, and medical devices right now. Very quickly, our goal here is to have you walk away with just a handful of gold nuggets around current landscape of PCCP, opportunities for it, some of the challenges with it, and hopefully some practical insights from what is known, with the caveat that these are very early days. So we can explain where we got some of our information, but we're all learning on this together. We'd welcome your feedback. We welcome your questions during the session if you have them. Please submit them in. We'll try and integrate it. A lot of you sent questions ahead of time, which we've tried to integrate into the conversation here. We will be done at 12:50 Eastern. Well, let me put it this way. You can drop off at 12:50 Eastern, knowing that you've gotten the full course set of content. That said, as is our custom, we will stay on till 1:30 p.m. Eastern, so a full 90 minutes, as long as there's questions to be answered. And frequently, we have a good 40% of the people in attendance are still with us at about 90 minutes. So with that, why don't we welcome our panelists? I'll have them introduce themselves, and then we'll give you a little background. So Ashley.
Everyone, I'm Ashley Miller. I'm the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at Digital Diagnostics, and I bring over 10 years of experience in regulatory affairs, a little over half of which supporting digital health and software as a medical device. Digital Diagnostics is a company that was able to get the first autonomous diagnostic device approved through the FDA. So I'm really excited to represent the company and talk about PCCP with everyone.
Welcome. You, a returning guest.
Yeah, happy Friday, everyone. My name is Yu Zhao. I'm the president of Bridging Consulting. We help digital health firms and traditional medical device companies with innovative yet practical regulatory clinical strategy. And also we help addressing different quality management systems issues like design control, risk management. Thanks, Orthogonal, for organizing this. I'm really pleased to be a part of this panel.
Bernhard.
Bernhard Kappa, founder and CEO of Orthogonal. I've been in software for about 30 years and about the last 15 or so in medical device software. Our sort of core guiding principle is using, modern methods to improve both the speed, effectiveness, and safety of medical devices, and leveraging software and software techniques, fast feedback loops. As part of that, we do an ever increasing amount of work in involving AI, and certainly the things that you can do potentially with PCCP to increase the frequency of updates for your software, not just for AI software, is something that we've been keenly interested in and working on over the last few years. So really looking forward to the conversation.
So normally we don't like to do a sort of a presentation. We're bigger on discussions, but certain topics like this, when we feel it's valuable to share a couple of slides and just give a little bit of background. So we're all sort of at the same point, and some of you aren't wondering what are they referring to with these things. First, though, Curly, could you pop up the first poll? We want to get a sense of what's going on in the audience and where you all are at. So if you could answer in the background when we're talking, what's your experience with PCCP today? You've submitted one, you're preparing one. I suppose if you've actually got one cleared, you can go under submitted. We're considering our first one the next few years. It's new to us. I want to learn more, and none of the above. I try to do an other because sometimes you get some interesting entries, but they don't allow that on these panels. So while you're filling that out, I'm going to share a couple of quick slides. And Bernhard, if you could take us through the first couple, I think we're looking to get through all these in about 4 minutes, if we can.
Okay, sounds good.
You already know us. There we go. You want to cover this one, Bernhard? What do you want me to do?
Do you want to cover it,
Yeah,
or
I'll
should
do this.
I?
So
Yeah.
basically, we were looking for a definition of what is PCCP. We looked around. There's an organization that's, I think, written some good stuff about this and also has a nice template, Ketrix. So I started from their definition. I made some modifications here to it, but credit to them for the core of it. PCCP is an innovative plan from the FDA that empowers manufacturers to refine and tune AI/ML algorithms through frequent deployments with the constraints of safety and effectiveness, but without the need to make additional pre-market submissions. And that's the key part. You have a guardrail set up within which you are allowed to make certain updates to algorithms with just a letter to file. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, AI/ML is designed to continuously learn. But in our industry, we haven't been able to take an extent of that really other than sort of, quarterly or less frequent updates to algorithms, but our algorithms are getting smarter a lot faster. So the question is, how can we take advantage of that? So it's a reduction in time and resources for manufacturers and regulators to get more updates out because regulators don't have to review them. We don't have to prepare full submissions. And it's giving flexibility for real-time improvements to enhance without bureaucracy. One clarifying point I'll put that I added onto this definition. PCCP is not specified to just cover AI/ML. The intention of PCCP is that it can cover other non-AI/ML software changes or potentially even hardware changes to a device under these parameters. However, really all the effort and focus right now and the initial guidance from the FDA are all around AI/ML. I've been told that they will be releasing at some point in the near future draft guidance on other kinds of updates under PCCP. But for today's focus, I think we're largely going to focus on AI/ML. All right, Bernhard, over to you.
Yeah, and so if we go back, right, FDA's only wants to really look at submissions where there is substantial claims, patient safety risks, etc. They want to lessen the burden for things where there isn't really heavy risk, etc. So there have been things for a while and guidance the FDA has on when you need to submit for software changes. There was the attempt at the pre-cert program, which actually gave much broader authority than actually the FDA ultimately had, and had to get rolled back. But the kind of first use of PCCP was in the position paper that the FDA did on continuous learning algorithms, right? And that one heavily referenced and was kind of entangled with the pre-cert program. But a lot of the sort of core principles of how the FDA thinks about this and what they're referencing was really contained in that that position paper. It's still a pretty good paper as long as you strip out the pre-cert program stuff that isn't necessarily relevant. So then since then, there have been lots and lots of AI algorithms that have been cleared by the FDA, most of them in radiology. There have been kind of not necessarily formally defined, but certainly a number of folks that really got predetermined change controls plans in place as part of what they did. There just was no, formal, here is how we do it. The FDA, I think, did feel that they needed more authorization around this. And so as part of the 2022 omnibus bill, the Fedora portion of that bill that got passed sort of post-election in 2022, in that period between November 7th and the start of the next Congress, they got a lot of that kind of stuff. Predetermined change control plans were actually kind of were basically authorized for the FDA. You, Randy, and I, and Ashley, and a number of people got together in early 2023 at the SAMD conference to analyze the Fedora work. And it was interesting in that the authorization was pretty broad. It was not specific to AI ML algorithms, and covered PMAs, de novos, 510Ks, really anything that the FDA had regulatory authority over that. The FDA had, I think, already been working on guidance on predetermined change control plans in 2023. Sorry, even before 2023, they had there was IMDRF guidance on guiding principles for good machine learning practices. And then in early 2023, I think April 2023, the draft guidance on marketing submissions recommendations for PCCPs. And then in the fall, guidance, another IMDRF guidance on guiding principles for PCCP. So there's a bunch of stuff that sort of coheres together around that. Everything in PCCP builds on the GMLP information and on other things that have been published. I still think the best guidance from the FDA on AI ML is the CAD-E pre-market stuff. So I would read that as a foundation for a lot of this that predates some of the PCCP stuff. Randy, do you want to take this one?
I can take this one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks, you.
Yeah, sure. So this was an excerpt from the Section 3308 of 2023 Omnibus Bill to amend the existing Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. If you like the legalese, you can read this. But Bernhard mentioned last year we had SAMD conference. As output of SAMD conference, we wrote a white paper. A section of the white paper, we take each one, go sentence by sentence to interpret in plain language. What does that mean? This specific section is 510K. There's another section for pre-market approval, PMA. Randy, I don't know if you have that handy. We can put the link to the white paper in the chat. So folks,
as soon as I stop sharing the PDF, I'll go over.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not going to read through this, but essentially, like Bernhard explained, PCCP is a new mechanism to allow the company to make, in some cases, significant changes post-market. The changes that typically, without a PCCP in place, you will need to submit a pre-market submission, either a new 510K or PMA supplement for it. But with an authorized PCCP, you can process the change as you will under your own quality management system and ladder to file without additional FDA submission, and you can implement the change right away after you finish all the quality system activities. Next slide. Right, so Randy mentioned today's focus is AI ML software PCCP, but industry and FDA has have been really busy in the past 12, 15 months. And if you look at the list, this is just partial list. Yes, there are a lot of PCCP authorized for software as medical device with AI ML enabled functions. And there are also dozens of PCCP authorized for hardware, a few for system, software / firmware plus hardware, and several for IVD as well. All right.
All right. Thank you. So that's it for this. So one final point, maybe one of you could cover, which is that even though PCCP didn't have a name, the concept is not brand new in the last couple of years, and it's been around since before we were talking about AI ML. Maybe one of you could explain a little bit about that for a bit.
Yeah, I can start. Yes, company at case-by-case basis have been working with FDA on similar plan or protocol. I only had personal experience with one case when we submitted a class 3 software SAMD under original PMA. I think it was back to 2015. We did include a post-market change management, a software change management plan with the FDA. We had long discussion, back and forth discussion on that plan, but it was part of our original PMA approval. And I'm sure other companies probably are doing the same thing with FDA. It was just not under a formal name or a formal program.
Okay. Great. So I think about PCCP kind of like being a parent with a teenager, where you want to give them more freedom. You don't want to be a helicopter parent, but at the same time, nobody's going to go back to parenting a teenager in the 1980s when it's like, all right, so you're going out with your friends, you know, I'll see you back, you'll be back by 11. You have no idea where they are or what's going on and no way to reach them. It's more like, okay, you can go out, but here's the constraints, you know. I want your phone on at all times. You answer it. You leave location tracking on. You can only get in a car with X and Y people driving and no more than X people in the car. You can't go any further with this. I don't want you hanging out with this kid or going to that place. Other than that, I'll see you at midnight. What is that like then if you translate that to the FDA giving the latitude to teenage medical device manufacturers?
I mean, I would say, like, so if we look at the that metaphor, right, the bounds of, be home by midnight, don't do this, don't do that, right? You have to stay within the intended use and the indications of use of the device. So it's really clear, if you go outside of the intended use and the indications for use, if you, for example, previously said this is only for adults or for a particular population, you try to extend that population beyond, that's going to be a new filing, right? And so within that, those are the kind of bounds, right? But then you could, if you potentially have new inputs, you have modifications to the algorithm itself. Those are all things that you can do as long as you have a path to say, we are going to be doing X, Y, and Z. And you can specify that ahead of time. It's not a blank slate that says, hey, as long as we stay within this, we don't know what changes we're going to make. But trust us, it'll be safe. We're not changing the intended use or indications for use, right?
Yeah,
Sticking with that.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go. Sticking with that metaphor, a third-time parent with 3 teenagers is going to have a little bit more bounds and allowance for that teenager to stick within and trust to stick within those bounds that they set. Whereas a parent with a toddler or a manufacturer with a device that has only been on the market for a couple of years, that parent or that FDA review team may not be as receptive to allowing some of these changes to be made without their oversight. So especially while the guidance is still in its draft state and the standards don't quite exist yet. So you have to keep in mind that we're working with different review teams and we're working with humans too that all have different levels of experience in this space.
Yeah,
So
I
to that
also
end- go ahead.
really like, Randy, your metaphor. I think this is a pretty proper metaphor. So in a way, you cannot issue a regulation to say, hey, all the parents in the United States, here's the way you control your kids, right? It has to be individualized. So in a way, PCCP really is your individual special control. You work together with FDA that makes sense for your device. So as long and with the PCCP in place, as long as you make changes within the bounds of your authorized PCCP and you follow the procedure you described and agree with FDA, FDA allow you to implement those changes in a very controlled way.
Yeah,
So
I think what Ashley said was really important here as well. That parent toddler metaphor is, the FDA is the parent and we are the toddlers or teenagers, right? In this regard. So some of the areas are really used to this and have sort of already well-trodden paths. In particular, radiology and imaging, where really, if our gold standard is two radiologists looking at an image, and that is kind of part of the process. There have been hundreds and hundreds of AI ML algorithms in that space. The original sort of driver for the continuous learning models from 2019 was in that space. That group is really, as long as you're doing something that doesn't really fully stretch the boundaries, is pretty comfortable with that. Whereas there are some other groups where, you're going in and applying something for the first time for a group that has never seen that, they're going to be a lot more cautious, right?
let me apply a different parenting metaphor, which is actually not so wrong, which is when you're a parent of your first kid and the kid drops their pacifier on the floor, you pick it up and you run and you drop it into a stove of boiling water on the stove till you convince it's sterilized, you bring it out, and then you give it back to the kid. By the time that you have your second kid, you just kind of go over to the sink and you turn on the faucet and you wash it off a little bit and you maybe put on a little soap and then you give it to the kid. And by the time your third kid drops the pacifier, you just kind of hand it to the dog to lick it off and then you give it back to the kid. So
I haven't gotten to the third kid stage. I only have two. So
but I have to tell you, having 3 kids, I hope my third kid isn't listening, but it's not too far off. But I think that notion, as you get more self-confident in your abilities as a regulator, so to speak, of what the domain is and what the problems are, you're able to loosen up a bit.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's true. Not necessarily on the rigorousness of PCCP, but toward the standardization of FDA review standard. Right now, FDA, they're like industry. They're still in pretty steep learning curve. Based on my limited experience with a few PCCP, interacting with only 2 review divisions, really depending on which review division you work with and which reviewers you're dealing with, the type of feedback, there's common elements, but the type of feedback, the requirements are quite different. I don't know what the PCCP, it will be easier from the review standard standpoint. I hope we're moving more toward kind of common standard. And same thing for the company. Once you go through your first PCCP with FDA, it will be much easier. The first one is pretty hard.
Yeah.
So we,
Sorry, let me add to that, right? In general, right, if you think about it, the more change you try to or the more you try to put into an FDA submission, right? We're doing this wonderful novel thing and this wonderful novel thing, and you're really sort of pushing the FDA, you know, very far on a bunch of different things. They're going to ask more and more questions, and they're going to require more and more data. So very often a more incremental approach gets you there faster and cheaper in general, right? So do one of these things first, then do the next, and then do the next with submissions, right? Otherwise, you are probably in a very expensive, very large, lots of data, prove it to me. Oh, we don't necessarily like that data. Give us more data, kind of a cycle, which is going to be longer. I think the same thing applies here. If, you know, if you are really sort of pushing a paradigm and saying this is going to be different, you already have a heavy lift, then adding PCCP to that, where, for example, they don't know what the reference standard, there is no reference standard, or establishing one is part of the important thing, probably not worth doing in that first submission. But once you have gotten there, further ones than a PCCP would make a lot more sense.
so we had a question that was so great, I'm kicking myself that we didn't think of it, so you'll be a little bit put on spot. Describe a hypothetical device and walk us through what the process of preparing and submitting a PCCP might look like.
Yeah, I can get started. So we don't actually need a hypothetical device. You know, let's say it's an AI/ML software, machine learning software. The three elements, key elements of the PCCP. Number one is a list of detailed modifications. So modifications has to be very detailed, very specific. Number two, you need to have predetermined protocols for developing, verifying, validating, and implementing this or those modifications. Then the third element is the impact assessment from the impact from those modifications. So in a PCCP, of course, you need to go in detail on these elements. In addition, at least in my experience, we make PCCP a standalone document. And meaning you need to kind of describe your overall device first, if it's a software, or the software modules or functions, so that the reviewer will get a really good idea of how the software works, even though your modification is only on one or two of the modules. Then you get into detail, talk about your modifications.
Yeah, and taking a little step further, as you'll see in the guidance document, it talks about the use of data. And when you prepare your modification protocol, it's not just writing a test protocol. You have to obviously include your acceptance criteria, but also the data that you're going to use and where you're going to get that, how you're going to sequester test data from training data, from tuning data. And other considerations would be, how often can you use that data? Where are you getting that data from? Is that data representative of the intended use? So there is a lot of work that needs to be done on the front end just to talk about the validation stage and how you're going to validate that with the data available.
Yep, and I think that's really true whether this is a PCCP or an initial submission, right? The same thing applies for an AI algorithms, really leveraging the good machine learning practices, you know, guiding principles, which include, you know, your data management and all the things like that. that flows throughout the process here.
So,
Right, so that's very true. I want to add a little bit caveat to it. Yes, many of the elements, data management, your truthing process will be in your 510K de novo or PMA. But with PCCP, it's almost the level of details will increase quite a bit. You're going to, let me just give one example. So for example, if we think about the typical 510K or de novo submission, we focus our energy on the final pivotal validation study. Where you get data from, how many different sites, from what type of patient, which truthing process you use to establish reference values. And we may have a paragraph or two to talk about our training process in very general terms in pre-market submission. Typically, you don't really need to get into details, but in a PCCP, in that data management section of the modification protocol section, FDA, at least from my experience, FDA expect similar level of detail when you talk about your training data management, tuning data, how you establish the reference value. So it's almost like same requirement, but it's on steroid.
So let me ask, because there's two related questions here from the audience that I think cover, and they're both about, is this basically letting us off on the hook on stuff we used to have to do? And generally the answer is no, but let me clarify both. One is 21 CFR 820 had an original requirement to validate software changes before making said change. Is PCCP considered validation of the change? No.
No. So the only thing PCCP does is to the pre-market submission. Your submission for a modification to the FDA and FDA review process. With an authorized PCCP, you can save your energy from submitting that particular change to FDA, and it will save FDA review division time and energy as well, so they can focus on other things.
It's yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's no change at all on your quality management system. You still need to follow your change control process to properly assess the impact of your modification, to understand, to review the existing risk management file, and to determine what kind of verification, validation you need to do. So there's absolutely no change on that.
So you're
It's
spelling
analogous.
out, basically in advanced,
Mhm.
these are, I can only make changes on these very specific things, nothing else. And I can only do it using X process, which I used before, which is essentially a repeat of my validation. It's on you to do the validation and describe exactly how you're doing it. No
And the
deviation.
same risk benefit analysis, et cetera, the impact assessment for change. I mean, it's right, it's in broad strokes, it has a lot of similarity to the existing guidance of when can you make changes to a device without filing, right? It sort of gives a very specific, narrow kind of maybe I wouldn't say extension, but just sort of clarification to that stuff, right?
Yeah, and the difference is between, I think the language is between a significant change and an insignificant change. And in fact, our white paper that we sent out the link to is titled "Making the Significant Insignificant," and it's about how do you widen the umbrella and what else can you try and put under it. Related question we had: does this?
Can I add one more comment, Randy?
Yeah.
So I just mentioned in terms of internal change control process, it remains the same. There could be some impact if you have authorized PCCP in place. So for example, if you have change, you review risk assessment, you decide you need to do testing 1, 2, 3. With a PCCP, because at the time you put PCCP together, you're imagining future modifications. The type of modification protocol the verification validation testing process you described and agree with FDA tend to be more conservative. So if you implement a PCCP change, I can imagine there's a scenario where your actual risk assessment indicated you only need to do testing number 1, some sort of regression test, versus PCCP, you already promised the FDA to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there could be some impact that way.
Yeah. Sorry, you're on mute, Randy.
Thank you. Similar question. Does this mean we can use PCCP to improve the performance of a medical device or software without needing clinical trials and make such a claim?
It really depends on your method of validation in the first place, right? So if you were able to use, benchtop validation, not necessarily prospective stuff for the initial one, then you can continue to use the same method, right? But if you needed to have clinical trials or clinical validation for that, there may be some very small things that you can do as long as you can argue that. But I don't think it's a get out of jail free card in that regard.
From what I've heard in the industry, it's not quite a get out of jail free card quite yet, especially, like I said, while the guidance is in draft. If you're making changes that could impact your performance claims, FDA is still wanting to see clinical data. But where you're obtaining that clinical data can be explained in that data management portion. And maybe you're not running a prospective trial. Maybe you can purchase it from a registry, for example. So those are all conversations you should have with the agency.
So part of the guardrails you would set up in the PCCP plan would be, we are allowed to state X about changes in the algorithm given Y and Z.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I agree. I think the way FDA reviews PCCP modification protocol section, they want to determine, the verification validation method you propose for that specific modification is scientifically sound. And one easy way to prove that is to tie this back to your previous 510K or de novo or PMA submission to say, we're going to repeat exactly what we did there, maybe with slightly different acceptance criteria. You have the freedom to present something different and with justification. But it's definitely not, get out of a jail-free card.
Does it let you deploy in unlocked algorithms? Somebody asks. Like one that continuously learns and is being applied in real time.
There is nothing that in the guidance that prevents you from doing that. There is a specific reference in the guidance to that, but I am not aware of any unlocked online learning algorithms that have been cleared by the FDA. So there, theoretically, and there is mention that is a possibility, but you will be the first, or someone will be the first for that. And remember, the possibility for this was already kind of alluded to in a white paper in that position paper in 2019. We're in 2024. To date, many cleared AI algorithms. No, none of them continuous online learning.
So it sounds like sort of PCCP is sort of a step in parenting. It's the first or second kid dropping the pacifier on the floor, laying the groundwork for the third one with the unlocked algorithm, potentially.
So, I mean, to Bernhard's point, I think the idea of approving an unlocked algorithm was what sparked the idea of a PCCP, but we haven't gotten to the point of allowing an unlocked algorithm yet. So maybe we can try out the PCCP with the locked algorithms first and see how that goes.
Yeah. right, there is within the guidance, in particular, the way they describe it is there are manual sort of changes, and then there are automatic changes, right? And they call out those two separately, and additional considerations for the automated changes, i.e., the continuous learning. I think even continuous learning, if you go back to the position paper, leveraged, as you say, the PCCP concept and really sort of limitations around that. So there's a framework for it theoretically. I think the first ones where it's going to happen are ones where there is not a whole lot of real-time risk and low risk things, right? The higher risk, the less likely you're going to get that, first, or in some cases, maybe ever, right?
I agree with you, Bernhard. I actually had the exact discussion not too long ago with a number of other regulatory consultants, and I think we get into a bet without putting money down at the end. We all forgot, but the bet was what the first adaptive machine learning or deep learning software will be approved by the FDA through a de novo PMA 510K, or it will be authorized under a PCCP. One of the consultants predict, because FDA still view adaptive machine learning algorithm is hard to control, has hard to control risks, and they may perceive high risk on this one. I disagree with him. I think the FDA risk classification will be primarily based on the indication for use. Yes, what type of technologies you adopt will pose some risk, but there could be risk control measures in place. I think getting the first adaptive ML model out of PCCP will be a much low risk way for FDA to learn from this. If you think about the de novo process, FDA is going to work with you to set up special control for a whole class of new devices and involve high risk. You try to imagine how different ways company can design your device, and the device, by the way, can learn and adapt by itself without human intervention. That's pretty high risk to FDA. Versus PCCP, as Bernhard said, we can pick an existing device. FDA already reviewed, understand your device, understand your clinical evidence, understand how device work in a locked fashion. And by the way, this needs to be a low risk application. So a class 2 510K existing device. Now, if you use a PCCP to describe in detail on the process itself, the parameters you put around, and what kind of modifications you allow the algorithm to make by itself, and what kind of modifications you have to get human in the loop. So if you describe all those information in the modification protocol in a way a typical 510K or de novo will not get into, and I will see FDA will have much easier time to authorize a PCCP to allow adaptive algorithm in a very controlled way, just for your firm, just for your software. So I think it's a much less risky way for FDA to go that route.
I have another option here for how this could happen, which is there is another pandemic, another thing where we require emergency use authorization for things, and we have a virus that mutates really rapidly, and et cetera, and so you really, if you're applying AI to to some of this kind of stuff, you want to be able to continuously learn for some of these things. that would be one where, just as with mRNA vaccines, you know, which we would not be where we are with those if we hadn't had that emergency use authorization. That would be a place where I could see that happening, a crisis that suspends the usual rules, and where the benefit of versus the risk is really high, right?
Well, hopefully the device company does have to start the pandemic in order to get this through.
I wasn't gonna go there, but I'm kind of glad you did. So, okay, a question from Naveen, our friend Naveen, Mr. Risk. Do you have any recommendations on how to best assess benefit risk of proposed changes in advance when AI/ML-enabled software is likely going to need frequent updates, many of them really not foreseen or predictable? Can you share examples of the kind of risk you foresee with such changes?
So this is a really interesting question. So in the FDA draft guidance document, it says, you know, the modifications you include in your PCCP has to be individual and specific modifications. You know, we mentioned earlier the PCCP white paper we put out last year. I remember, Randy, we had a question on this, which was related to abstraction of the chain modifications we can put in PCCP. And we talked about the difference between a individual, specific individual modification versus a type of modifications. We actually put put that into practice and try something really interesting. And we pulled through a PCCP authorized by FDA earlier this year. So in that PCCP, we kind of did two things, pretty new at that time. One is we include modifications to the machine learning module. And we also included changes to non-machine learning software within the same software system. So that's number one. Number two, we cover a broad types of changes in that PCCP for all modules included, essentially to a degree that, you know, we can cover the company for the next few years. The type of modifications we made, we need to also, you know, describe the detail and put some boundary among those modifications. But so a way to deal with you know, the issues from this question, if you're lucky enough, you're able to describe your modification in PCCP in a relatively broad, and I don't want to say broad or general, in that can apply to multiple potential modifications you will make. The description still needs to be very specific, but instead of describing a specific individual change, what we did, we described a specific types of changes. So if you're able to do that, that will give you a lot of freedom, you know, fitting different changes under PCCP authorized modifications.
I would give here's like a couple of things here around this. So let's say you have a mobile application, right? BYOD, so it could be working on a lot of different hardware and OS versions. And this thing, I'm not going to say what the use is, but it's going to use the microphone, and there's an AI algorithm on the device, so it's going to be potentially have dependencies on the GPU within the smartphone, right? So fairly clear on the microphone that if that's an input to your algorithm, right? So different microphones, different things might behave in different ways. And so you can characterize what those differences might be. Similarly with the GPU, if there's a different GPU, what kind of potentially tweaks you might need to do and testing you might need to do for different GPUs that your algorithm runs on, whether it's a Samsung Galaxy XYZ or an iPhone or something else, right? So you can really clearly characterize what those changes might be and how you would go about doing that type of thing, right?
So
And what the risks
got-
are around it, right?
So if you just got your submission in by the skin of your teeth and you accumulated a lot of technical and regulatory debt, you're probably not in a good position to slam a PCCP in with that, I'm guessing.
Right, correct. I think another good one, again, for things like if you're doing quantitative imaging, right? There's guidance on technical performance assessment of quantitative imaging in, what is it called? It's in radiological devices in pre-market submissions. That talks about things like different types of errors you might have, sources of error and risk management around that. That's a good one to look at because those are some of the things that you might want to consider as part of your risk management around that, both in terms of inputs, but then also around the training and testing of your models as well.
Right, and then I think part of this question kind of got into, if our company is new to the PCCP, how should we think about whether we should, just try it out? I think it's a great tool to reduce regulatory submission burden for both company and FDA while accelerating the speed of your innovation. However, it has pretty steep learning curve for both sides. And even after you overcome the initial learning curve, you'll still think in order to put together a good PCCP, it takes a lot of initial, strategic discussion, and it requires time and resources, significant time and resources. It's definitely not the best regulatory tool for every company or every project. You need to think about your business needs, right? Whether you have specific plan modifications you want to try, or it's something may or may not happen in the future. If you have a simple modification and you're going to do this, it would be much, much easier to submit that under 510K, or maybe you'll qualify for special 510K. Like I mentioned, the amount of information you put in a typical PCCP will be much, much greater than the information you put into a pre-market submission. And you need to go through your regulatory assessment. If it's letter to file changes, anyway, you definitely don't need to have a PCCP for that. Then you need to look at the amount of effort you're going to put into it.
So would you recommend at this point in time, if you're going to submit a PCCP, you should probably cover it in a pre-sub meeting?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to jump in and say, you need the Q-sub process for this. Just jumping into a PCCP 100%. With a 510K without any feedback from the FDA is, from what I've seen, a recipe for disaster, basically.
Okay.
I would agree. If it's your first PCCP, definitely pre-sub will help you. Or even if you have PCCP authorized, and if you're going to submit a new PCCP to a different review division, pre-sub probably still is a good idea. However, we all know pre-sub has its downside as well. If you look at average pre-sub, if you count the time you prepare for the pre-sub, waiting, submit to FDA, waiting for the meeting, submitting, writing and submitting meeting minutes, typically it's a 3 to 5 months process. With topics like PCCP, where you're going through the learning curve with FDA, it's unlikely you'll get everything sorted out through just one pre-sub. So you may have to repeat pre-sub twice, 3 times, and that's a year and a half. As a regulatory strategy, in some cases, if you have good understanding of PCCP, for example, if you're lucky enough to hire someone who had PCCP experience or who were in the discussion with the same review division on PCCP with another company, or if you're able to get a regulatory consultant who had experience, as a strategy, in some cases, even though this is your first PCCP, you may just want to submit a well-written PCCP in your 510K or de novo. That way, remember, whatever agreement you get from pre-sub is non-binding. But information, if you submit PCCP in your pre-market submission, FDA will give you very specific, exhaustive list of deficiencies. And so you have 180 days to address them, address these. And also you have the opportunities to drop it last minute. If you find out, those questions are too long, too difficult, and you also need to address other deficiencies from the same additional information ladder, you can always drop it last minute and get your other, things through 510K or de novo. I'm not suggesting a company just put a plan together and submit, try your luck. This is what I heard from another webinar. If your PCCP, the PCCP you're going to submit is less than 10 pages, you probably not have enough detailed information the agency is looking for. FDA did not put guidance on the length of the document, but as a kind of a reference, the PCCP we got authorized, the final version, with 39 pages.
Yeah, you make a good point, If you're planning to make a significant change that requires a 510K anyway, and you're not married to the PCCP idea, you could absolutely throw it into the submission with the plan to withdraw it and be okay with that strategy if you need to get clearance anyway.
Could you come back
but knowing,
later on?
well, you can come back later on during a pre-sub after you get clearance on that one change you were making. So you can get clearance and then do the pre-sub process kind of in tandem. Another option is during the submission, if you really want to try to get that PCCP cleared during that submission, you could do a Q sub for a submission issue request and have that conversation with the FDA to see if there's ways that you can modify the PCCP during the deficiency period to get it cleared. But you still run into those same timelines. Do you want to do it on the pre-sub side or during the submission review side?
And I think the other piece here is, right, you're spelling out individual modifications. It could be multiple modifications. So you may get granted on, say, if you have 3 modifications, granted on 2 and not granted on the 3rd as part of that, right? So there's, there is, it's not necessarily all or nothing in that regard too.
Can you come back in a resubmission on the existing device and either introduce a PCCP for the first time or submit a modification of PCCP? For instance, you found some stuff that's in a gray area and now you've proved it's not gray.
Yes and yes.
You don't get one shot on an initial submission for the life of the device, right?
No, they consider it a technological characteristic. So if you want to make a change to your device to introduce a PCCP or change the PCCP, that's significant enough to warrant a 510K in itself.
Yeah.
Do you think that'll come? That companies will do that on existing devices, or will you'd come back and clarify later on certain things or expand it?
Right.
I have heard of, sorry, go ahead, you.
I was going to mention, we're actually working on 510K submission for existing device just to submit PCCP to allow future modification to be made without submission. So yeah. And if you look at FDA database, there are only probably less than a handful of examples where companies submit a modified PCCP or PCCP updates in a subsequent 510K as well.
Yeah. I would say on the we are heavily focused on the AI ML because that's where there is draft guidance and where most of the momentum has been. But as you pointed out at the beginning, there have been a number of other ones that are not AI ML algorithm changes and PCCPs for other types of changes, hardware, software changes, etc. And I know, Randy, you had said that there is probably guidance coming all around that. I suspect that may take a little while to get there because, you know, it's such a broad subject as to what types of changes you might be making, right? There are a lot that are plausible, but then it probably comes down to the individual, reviewers, the which area you are in, et cetera. Have they seen lots of PCCPs, et cetera, or changes of that nature, right? We were talking about this earlier about a plausible one. Mileage might vary around how this might happen. So, for example, let's say you have a mobile application that does hypnotism therapy and uses a recorded voice in order to do that hypnotism therapy. There is actually a device cleared by the FDA called Regulora that does exactly that. You could imagine that it would be potentially useful to test different voices and then have a modification to the device where for certain subpopulations or certain people, these voices work better than these voices, right? That would be the kind of thing that could fit well under a predetermined change control plan, because you know exactly how you're going to be making the changes, how you're going to be testing those, probably some kind of an IRB or something obviously required for that, but you could combine that process with the PCCP so that you don't have to, I have 5 new voices that you don't have to do a regulatory submission each time for that, even if those voices are AI generated rather than actual human voices, right?
And this is a pretty good examples. This is type of question I got from pretty much every times. What's allowed on the PCCP? And the way I tell them, not to encourage them to try it out, but encourage them to at least to think about PCCP, to evaluate the pros and cons. I tell every one of them, the only limit is your imagination. So let me explain. We already mentioned PCCP could be applied to any sorts of pre-market submission. De novo, 510K, PMA, even though HDE was not specifically mentioned, but it's Class 3 approval. I believe it should be covered as well. HDE is for humanitarian device exemption for orphan devices. It covers software. We talked a lot about AI ML. Covers hardware, firmware for PMA products, because we also have to submit manufacturing process qualification. It can cover manufacturing process changes, material changes, related material changes, and related biocompatibility testing protocol. If you want to extend your shelf life, you can do that through PCCP. You can change your sterilization parameters using PCCP. You can add interoperability or compatible devices using PCCP. You can even, submit PCCP for contingency plan of relocate your facility to somewhere else, manufacturing facility. So it's really limitless. The only thing in my mind is not allowed under PCCP is to modify your intended use. You want to conserve your intended use. FDA probably will tell you you don't want to modify the indication for use as well. I would agree in general. The moment you update your indication for use, it may require substantial new clinical evidence. But there may be scenario where I would consider PCCP for expanding indication for use. So, for example, I'll make up a device. Let's say it's a software, standalone software, to somehow calculate your blood pressure. So blood pressure monitoring software. And in your pre-market approval or clearance, somehow FDA force you to limit your indicated patient population to age 83 years old. It could be because your clinical data, that's the oldest patient you had, or the type of training data you used, you didn't get older patient. Assuming that's the case, once you put a device in the market, as long as the company is not actively promoting off-label use, you're going to see older patient use your software, and you're going to collect a lot of new data, real-world data. I think it's perfectly fine. At least I would try to put together a PCCP for this scenario to say, here's type of data we're going to collect if they're existing. Here's the testing modification protocol we're going to go through to show the effectiveness of this device on 93-year-old. And so even in some very special cases for indication for use modifications, I would consider a PCCP as well.
I think the FDA will get there eventually, if not soon. In the guidance in the example Appendix B, there's a skin lesion software device that talks about how the device was originally validated with a specific camera. Now, the devices in my space, you can look at the clearance letters. All of our AI/ML devices are validated with a specific camera, and that camera had to go into our indications for use statement. So if you read through the guidance, they make mention about not being able to modify the indications for use under a PCCP. But then in their example document, they say this skin lesion software indicated with or validated with a specific camera can potentially add cameras under modification scenarios. So they kind of contradict each other in the guidance, but that tells me that they're still thinking about these types of indication for use labeling expansions being able to be put under a PCCP at some point.
Yeah,
and
when you tell FDA your PCCP include modification to indication for use statement, I think their antenna will be up. So a good regulatory lesson is in the initial indication for use statement, try to keep that as short as possible.
Companies try.
Yeah, I think that's the right. So some of this is, especially for things, let's just say you are, in theory, taking advantage of the multiple function device guidance, right? So let's say BYOD mobile app, and you're using sensors, you're using whatever on that. Even though it's multiple function device guidance, that guidance says, hey, you need to take into considerations dependencies on the other functions, and so that's also in the AI/ML guidance, the PCCP guidance. Hey, you may need to take that into consideration. In some cases, right, the risk isn't particularly high, and they will say, you know what, we don't really care so much about the underlying smartphone technology, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's low risk. We don't consider it a risk. You may not need to put that in your indications for use, which smartphones it's on. In fact, the vast majority of things have been just in general for BYOD smartphone apps, at the beginning, companies really needed to have a platform compatibility testing and certification strategy and publish those things. That's kind of gone away over time with the FDA. So I'd expect the same kind of thing here, that the more they see it, the less they will sort of level that up and restrict the changes.
Right. I mean, your first submission for a smartphone, Bernardo, a BYOD smartphone, you had to usability test the
Whether someone could
download an app from the App Store, right?
that was a human factors considered. That was it got bounced back from the FDA, and the FDA said you've got to test whether someone can actually download the app from the App Store. First and only time in my experience that has happened to us, but it did happen back then.
Back in the day.
I think one of the things that Ashley said earlier on kind of the different groups you might be dealing with, right? It's worthwhile if it is AI ML, or in general if there is a PCCP, looking at how many have there been already, right? If the answer is there have been none in this area, chances are they're going to be much more risk averse than in an area where, like, we have, like, in the imaging space where it's like we have a lot of AI ML algorithms and we already have a lot of PCCPs. We are comfortable with it, right? Don't expect that to be much harder if this group has not seen it before.
That's really good point. I think, of course, there's difference even within the same review divisions, among different reviewers, but in general, the familiarity and comfort level toward not only PCCP, but underlying type of product technology will be important consideration.
Yeah.
3 related questions. I'll try and group them here and sort of just answer them as a ball of questions. 2 are related to the data. Is it generally the case that raw data used in original device validation could be used to reuse and revalidate the device after an update? And this would be a major part of defining the PCCP, or is it generally expected that new patient data is required for new validation? Number 2, without actually reviewing new data, how can you estimate performance changes? And number 3 is, what kind of metrics can you use to measure performance changes?
Right. So these are all really great questions. The type of details you need to put into your PCCP. And even if you don't, FDA is going to ask for it. The way you're going to collect new data, whether or not you can leverage existing test data set as a whole or in part in your validation study for modified software. I would say yes, you can. As long as you have your plan in place, you can leverage your existing testing data set. You already used once. However, we had back and forth discussion with FDA what kind of boundary we need to put there. So, for example, if you use your existing test data set that you used to test the original AI ML software, and you made modification, you use exactly the same test set to validate your modification. If you pass, at least in our case, FDA agree with us that we can use the test data again for future modification, maybe with or without additional new data. However, if you fail the validation test for the modifications, we're going to throw out the entire data set, collect new modification. And the reason for that is to prevent company to learn from prevent the algorithm to learn from the testing data set. And you don't want be in a scenario where your test data set kind of leak into the training process. Another thing kind of related to this is even if you get the new test data, at least in the PCCP, we agree with the FDA. We agree that the modified software has to go right back to the drawing board. You have to look at test results, modify or retrain the modification the ML algorithm. You cannot use the same modification, failed one test set, select new test set, and try to test again. And eventually, if you do this, you will find test set that will let you pass. And that's not a good idea. So, this kind of details will be surfaced during your discussion. And I think it's a good idea to think through that and putting together your proposal in the modification protocols.
So basically,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Randy.
Go ahead.
I was just going to throw out one more parenting metaphor. Basically, if you're going to train on old SAT test questions, they can't put them in the SAT you're actually going to take.
Yeah, and you have to consider the modification too. Obviously, to take Yu's example earlier, if you are submitting a PCCP to bring the indicated age of your device from 83 down to 70, you can't test that with the patient population from 83 and up unless you have the data from the 70-year-old population in sequester held somewhere else. You can use that validation data, I think, later on, but you have to make sure that the data you're reusing is still representative of the patient population at the time of validation. If prevalence of a disease in certain populations go up and you don't have the prevalence of that disease within that population in your data set, it may not be appropriate to use anymore.
I would say pretty generally, right? If we there are while the sort of guiding principles for good machine learning practices that are really high level and kind of mom and apple pie to some extent, there is a lot more detailed data science work, and there are pretty good more in-depth white papers, guidance, etc., around different techniques and ways that you can leverage data, slice data different ways for training and for verification, etc. Like the whole series from Xavier out of the AI conferences from a number of years ago. Really good stuff in that. One of the big things here is in your processes for how you're actually training the data and verifying it, you absolutely want to keep track of how you used what data and provide evidence of that. So while you may have some discovery things that you are doing where you're just experimenting and you care about your experiments from a don't want to repeat the experiments over again, if you're training in earnest for things, you definitely want to have that ideally in an automated way where you can show records specifically for how data was used in the process, right?
Yeah.
And then I think in some cases, there is again, CADI guidance is really good, and other guidance that talks about standalone performance assessment and how that needs to be separated. I think that also applies in many of these cases.
Yeah, and Randy, I think another part of the same question was what kind of performance standard are you going to use for making your modifications? So again, I think this is type of detail you need to put into the protocol sections. Like I mentioned, either it would be easier to convince the FDA if you just use exactly the same test protocol acceptance criteria you use to clear or get your original device approved, because FDA felt comfortable with that. But that does not prevent you from modify the original protocol. FDA's reviewers are very sensitive on the device performance level. So really depending on the initial algorithm you get cleared. For example, if it has sensitivity of 89%, specificity of 92%, not greatest, and if in your performance criteria you use the modified software need to be non-inferior to the previous one, that's fine. But in case of previously cleared device does not have the best performance, FDA will worry about your first modification will bump that up to 90/93. Then your subsequent modification, if you still use the original performance as your performance criteria, will be worse than the first modification. And that's something FDA is worried about. And there's either way to get around that. You can say the performance standard will be the best performing sensitivity, specificity of all release software. So it's something you need to pay a lot of attention to.
I have a question around this as well. I haven't seen this, but it's something I worry about, right? If you introduce a PCCP and they don't necessarily feel comfortable with a PCCP, could it be that, they require larger data sets and higher performance criteria than if you had not submitted a PCCP, right? Even in the base 510K, right? Is that a risk
I think it's unlikely if FDA already accept your previous performance and clear that. As long as
I'm saying if you're doing it as part of a new one, new device 510K, and you're doing a PCCP as part of that, would they be more, might there be a chance that they would otherwise have granted you something with again lower performance criteria and smaller data sets than if you add the PCCP, then they examine it and say, well, you know what, for the PCCP and for your base current one, we really want more data and we want a higher threshold, right?
I think that's entirely possible. I think going back to the caveat I mentioned previously, for PCCP, you and the FDA is trying to imagine what could happen in the future, and we tend to be more conservative. Versus for pre-market submission, you already know what exactly you're going to modify. You know the output of your risk assessment on the modification, and you can tailor your testing with really good justification for smaller sample size, for example. So I think, yeah, definitely I can see that happening.
Especially if you propose reusing the prospectively gathered data, I could see them wanting a bigger data set on the front end rather than reusing a subset of 50 patients.
A one-trick pony data set over and over. All right, so a couple closing. We'll take one more question that's written here, but first, thank you all for attending. I want you to know that you are all extremely statistically representative because once again, we're at 90 minutes almost and just about at 40%. So, I think we're actually doing a little better this time, but I don't know what that number is or whether none of you are actually listening and just walked away from your laptops maybe. But anyway, we want to thank you for joining us. There will not be a July webinar. We are taking a summer break on the assumption none of you would show up anyway, but send us your suggestions for August, September, October, November webinars. Thank you very much to our panelists for this. I was reminded by our partner, John at Orca One, Orthogonal with some collaborators has decided to boil the ocean and manually build the list of every SAMD ever approved by the FDA because there's no way to query for it. We are crowdsourcing suggestions, so go use our list, and then if your devices are missing or an area that you think is a rich vein of SAMD to find somewhere in the FDA data, please let us know. The last question I wanted to make sure we covered, because it was actually somebody submitted it before, and then they submitted the exact same question here. Basically, they give a quote from the PCCP legal language, and then they're like, this is very generic and confusing. What are they saying? So I'll read you the quote. The PCCP should be described in the 510K summary, de novo decision summary, PMA summary of safety and effectiveness document, parentheses SSED, and approval order. Details of the PCCP should be included in sufficient detail in the public-facing documents to support transparency to users of FDA's determination of substantial equivalence or reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for the device and its range of specifications. And they're saying, all right, what does that actually mean?
So I actually look into, did keyword search on PCCP, predetermined change control plan, try to find out examples of 510K summary, de novo, reclassification order. Unfortunately, while this may be expectation from the agency that PCCP should be included, described in your 510K summary, and it should be in your labeling as well. Unfortunately, there's huge difference from what I've seen so far. There are 510K summary that did not even mention the term PCCP or predetermined change control plan, or the hardware PCCP did not contain anything. The word PCCP was only included in FDA clearance letter, mentioning you submit PCCP, but that was it. And most of the other PCCP 510K summary, mention PCCP, but has a paragraph of 2 or 2 on PCCP. Only, I think 3 or 4 PCCP has sufficient detail for company to really understand it. Same thing for labeling. I did not see any consistency on FDA as a company to add PCCP into labeling.
Yeah, most of the summaries I've seen just say we submitted a PCCP that include generic software modifications and a protocol for validating them. And unfortunately, right now, I think companies that are submitting PCCPs are just using their predicates as examples for how much detail to include. So I think once the guidance gets finalized and more companies utilize this process, the description in the 510K summaries and public-facing documents will just continue to get more robust as we go on.
Yeah.
So the answer to the question is it depends how soon you're submitting it.
Right. Yeah.
So this specific transparency is sort of in the submission to help others, right? I think that's how that is written. But obviously there are, as part of your process of updating your product, right? There are probably some more just user specific transparency questions as well, right? So you need to take that into consideration as well. For specific types of products, there is, maybe some more specific guidance on what kind of transparency might be needed. Like quantitative imaging, again, if you look at that particular one, you could see how that might apply to PCCPs because it applies to, the baseline quantitative imaging functions in terms of what kind of, what the performance characteristics are. So in this case, how have the performance characteristics changed? Would be an example of some of the transparency, probably also why it has changed and what data you've used for that would be something that you would want to provide to your end users as part of your update process.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think in the original statutory language, it has a requirement for the secretary to may impose the requirement for labeling, for the exact reason you mentioned, Bernhard, for transparency to the users, that this software may be modified under PCCP, and which version you're looking at, what kind of performance you're going to use to validate those software. But unfortunately, so far, there's a huge difference among different review divisions. It has not been enforced. Related to this, one of the things on my do and don't, this one's on the don't list. When you submit a 510K or de novo with the PCCP, don't be cute and try to hide your PCCP in some of the sections. You have to mention that explicitly in your cover letter. So this is not transparency, but otherwise FDA may come back, even if they clear your 510K, they may come back to say, hey, you hide this pretty well, and we did not review your PCCP, therefore you did not have a PCCP authorized.
Don't try and slip it in. And with that happy thought, since we're at our time, I want to thank all of our attendees. I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. A lot of key points we covered. I apologize for the couple questions we weren't able to get to. If you have questions, reach out to us, and I hope all of you go and download our white paper. And again, I would also recommend taking a look at the Ketrix blog in PCCP template. I think it's good, and it's right now, as far as I've seen, the only good thing out there. There will be more coming, but right now, if you're looking for something, I'd take a look at that. Thank you all.
Yep, I would add one thing to this. Obviously, both Orthogonal and Bridging Consulting can help companies around this. We collaborate a lot on regulatory quality areas, as well as implementation of these types of things. If you need help or just want to touch base with us individually around that, we don't bite. We're happy to provide help, but we can also, do work for you guys. So
thank you very much for that final edition, Bernard.
Thanks for the shout out.
All right.
Everybody.
Take care, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.